Last week we started the Imagining Hope by looking at three questions. I found it really interesting. A number of people last week came back and said, that was really spot on for me last Sunday sermon. I could say it felt like I was writing the sermon for me. It was so the exact stuff that I wrestle with all the time. And we thought about these three questions about priority, about where we spend our time, what we think about, and where we invest our money. The challenge at the end of the service was, what do we need to look at our lives, and is there anything that we need to say no to so that we can say yes to God? And in a sense, we're going to explore what that yes might mean today. What is that yes that we are wanting to say yes to, to God? So God is inviting us to be part of what the official term is the Missio Dei. It's a theological term that basically says God is inviting us to be part of God's mission, part of the mission of God. It's what Jesus was referring to in Matthew chapter 9 when he said that the harvest is plentiful but the workers are few. It's what Jesus meant when at the end of Matthew he said, "Go into all the world and make disciples of all people," helping them know and follow Jesus. It's the main priority of what we should be doing as a church. And if you look at our priorities, it is our main priority. Faith and discipleship is the top thing on that list. That as a church we feel called to help people deepen their faith and discipleship in Jesus. That's not only for us who are gathered here, but reaching out and helping make other disciples as well. For those of you who are doing the Imagining Hope Bible studies, who's doing them? I have now printed 125 Bible study booklets, so somebody's reading them. If you haven't got one, there are more at the back now. I don't mind printing more. Grab a hold of one and have a look through them. They're really great. And there's also some videos attached to it. If you go to our website, follow through to the Imagining Hope resources page, you will see a lot of stuff there, including links to the electronic copy of the brochure. But you'll also can follow through to the Bible study resources and watch the videos that go with them as well. And the one for this week, I just love. It's got a really great message that comes through in the Bible study for this week. For those who haven't seen it, let me give you some context of what was happening in the week today. In the video for this week, there's a bloke who they call Bullhorn Guy. We would call him Megaphone Guy, but apparently in America, some people call megaphones bullhorns. I don't know. But they called him Bullhorn Guy. And the bloke who does the videos, Rob, is reflecting upon this bloke that he saw who stood on the corner of, this busy street with his brochures about Jesus and stood with his megaphone yelling at people that they are sinners, they're going to hell, and they had to turn to Jesus. Rob was watching this man and noticed that nobody stopped. Nobody took one of his pamphlets. Nobody was listening. And he reflects, he said, "Bullhorn Guy, it just isn't working. What you're doing is not working." But later in the video, he says a really powerful line. He says, "We might nod our agreement at that line that this isn't working." But he goes, if that's not the way, then what is? If that's not the way, then what is? It's a question that really hit me when I was watching this. If I think that preaching on a street corner about people going to hell is not the right way to do God's mission, then what is our way? And what am I doing about it? At least Bullhorn Guy's out there giving it a go. Can I say that I'm doing that? It's a huge question. What is the right way in the context of where we're at now in this world, in Turramurra? What is the right way of doing the mission of God then? This is a huge topic. And I've struggled to try and find how I could limit myself to a 12-minute sermon on this topic. So I've limited myself just to a couple of really punchy points instead, but I will admit right up front, I'm not covering this topic in any sort of complexity and completeness. But the first point I want to make on this topic is that I think we need to realise that the mission of God is not just what happens inside the walls of this church. It is bigger than that. And a number of years ago, I found a couple of cartoons that I just love. I don't know if you can see that clearly enough. It's got two little lines there about where we think God is and where God actually is. And the dotted line is where we think God is, which is in the church. Where is God actually? Well, everywhere. God is already at work everywhere. Here's the other cartoon that I like. You could say where the church is the title of the cartoon. But I could also change that to where God is. God is everywhere. And God is already at work in our community, in our world, in our church, in our lives. In a sense, participating in the mission of God is not going out there and starting something from scratch. As the young people at Night Church looked at the other week, it's like a surfer going, I need to go out there and make the waves. It's not. The waves are already there. All the surfer needs to do is to work out what's the best way to ride them. And that's the same with God's mission. God is already at work. What we need to do is to work out the best way to participate in what God is already doing in our lives, in our church, in our community. Which leads me to the second point. Sometimes we need to expand our definition of what God's mission is. Sometimes, for those of us who grew up in last century, it's scary that I can say that, but it's true, isn't it? For those of us who grew up in last century, when it comes to understanding God's mission, back then if we were answering that question, we probably would have said God's mission is about going out... Oops, why didn't that work? There it is. To preach the good news of forgiveness that comes through the cross of Jesus. That is what the mission of God is about. And whilst that is not wrong, in our Bible studies, the writer of the Bible studies, Carolyn, wants to say, I think the mission of God is much bigger than that. That is part of it, but it's much bigger than that. And in the Bible studies, we actually had a little table that had the 5 marks of mission, which were to preach the good news of the kingdom, to teach, baptise and nurture new believers, to respond to human need by loving service, to seek to transform unjust structures of society, and to strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the life of the earth. She sort of says that's a much broader understanding of what God's mission is. And she goes on to say that this is not a checklist for churches to go, well, God's mission is if we get a tick next to every one of those. And she sort of said, different churches will do God's mission in different ways. And different people will do God's mission in different ways. I have 2 good friends, James and Gabrielle, who are passionate about telling people about Jesus. They will go and intentionally make friends with people just so that they can tell them about Jesus. I have other friends, Jonathan and Sue, who live out their faith in a practical way of doing things that care for the environment. That is their faith expression, and they live their life in a way that does that. My friend Judy is all about social justice. Anything about raising awareness or doing social justice makes her faith come alive. Even within this church, we have different expressions of this. Teresa, why do you do the thing on Wednesday as an expression of your faith to be reaching out and helping those in need? It's an expression of your faith. Those young people who come and serve so faithfully on a Friday night running all our youth groups, why do they do that? Because they want to reach out and nurture faith in young people and help them to experience the same thing as they've experienced in Jesus. Whereas people on Friday night who do the dish do it for a completely different reason. They're reaching out and helping those in need, the poor and the homeless in Hornsby. Can you see how this is working? All of those are an expression of our faith in doing God's mission. But they're very different. All of them are legitimate ways. And if standing on the street corner screaming into a megaphone, if we say that's not working, then maybe this list gives us a picture of some things that might work in today's context in our society today. The beauty of this is that you can find an area that you are passionate about. So if you're going, I could never stand on the corner and tell people about Jesus, that's just not me. The good news is, well, you don't have to do that. You can find out a way that you can participate in God's mission that works for you, that lights your fire, that makes your faith come alive, something that you are passionate about. In the Imagining Hope Bible studies, you can actually read in the blue section some stories of some great historical figures who all lived out their faith in different ways, in ways that made sense to themselves, whether it was Mother Teresa helping the poor, or Desmond Tutu fighting against unjust structures in society, or Charles Wesley, who was all about John Wesley. Charles Wesley wrote the hymns. John Wesley going out and teaching people about Jesus and helping them have that depth of understanding. They're all different, but you would also say they are living out the mission of God. They are participating in the Missio Dei. Which is why I'd really encourage us to think about what it means for us to participate in God's mission. What is it for us? How would you answer the questions? What is your understanding of God's mission? And how is it lived out in your life? I would also add the third question there. What lights your fire? What's your passion about? What are some of these things that I've said today which you go, yes, that's me. That's what lights my faith up. That's what makes me feel like I am serving in the mission of God. Those three questions are really important because it is personal to us. If it's different for each person, we've got to work out, what does it mean for me? Which leads me to my last point. Because if the definition of the mission of God is quite broad, I've just broadened it quite extensively, does that sort of mean that anything fits into the mission of God then? For example, I might go, I am really passionate about watching television. I am good at it. I've got a talent at it. I am really passionate about doing it. I can do it for 5 hours straight if I want to. Maybe I can serve God by watching television because that's my passion. Does that work? You would argue no, probably not. But so where is these boundaries then when we say, no, that's probably not part of the mission of God then? How do we work this out? One of my colleagues in ministry, Reverend Jeff Stevenson, once told me a great analogy that I've never forgotten about this. You see, Jeff not only is a Uniting Church minister, in his spare time he plays saxophone in a jazz band. They are actually really good. I'd love to get them out here one time. There's a bunch of them, really great jazz players. But one time he was explaining to me the beauty of jazz. And he was saying, if you're in a jazz band, jazz is music. It's all about, there's a huge breadth of jazz styles. But he sort of says in every piece of jazz music, there are some fundamentals that are the same. And so you sort of have to learn what are these fundamentals. And he sort of said, you've got to have, a similar rhythm in the song. There's a rhythm that you get used to. There's often a chord progression that's part of the jazz song. And if you get all the same people playing in the same key and the same rhythm and the same chord progressions, then the beauty of jazz is that then you can improvise on top of that. And if you've ever seen Jeff play, that's what he does. You'd see him going, yep, I'm off. And he just launches into the saxophone and plays on top of whatever the others are playing. And it's extraordinary. But he's got to get the fundamentals right before he does the improvisation. Is that making sense? I think it's the same as it comes to God's mission. When we're talking about the mission of God, the Missio Dei, there are some fundamentals that we've got to get right if we're going to participate in that. It is about sharing the good news of Jesus with the world in our words and actions. It is about establishing God's kingdom here on earth. But I think our Bible reading made it even more simple. If I wanted to say, what is the fundamental aspect of God's mission? If I wanted to sum up it in one word, it would be, who listened to the Bible reading? Love. Love. And I'm not just saying that because it's a nice word that sort of encapsulates everything. It actually is the answer. Not only if you read the Bible reading for today, you just got to look at Jesus' ministry and look at the teaching that fits around Jesus' ministry. It's all about love. God's mission is sharing God's love to a world that desperately needs it. It's about sharing the love of God as shown through Jesus. And it is about loving others in the same way as God has loved us. Love is the key of the song that we are invited to join in of. John says that it's all about love. In our Bible reading, it says everything that God thinks and does is driven by this love, because God is love. God calls us to love one another. We love because God first loved us. If love is the foundation of all that we do, then we know God because God is love. John just goes over and over and over again saying love is the key. Or in terms of jazz and the mission of God, if I go back to that, what is the key that we are playing in? Love. We've got to get the right key. What are things like the chord progressions and the rhythm? Are things like, well, that's the example that Jesus has shown us to follow. Jesus says, I've done these things so that you can follow my example, that you can love one another too. And then on top of that, we can begin to improvise. So once we get those foundations right, then whether it is, like my friends James and Gabrielle, making friends so they can bring them to Jesus, or whether it is, doing environmental stuff to save this world that we are in, or whether it is social justice or caring for the poor or reaching out for those in need, or whatever it is, the improvisation's up to us, but we got to get the fundamentals right. So I might want to argue that watching television is part of the mission of God, but I don't think that fits the fundamentals. When we look at Bullhorn Guy yelling and screaming at people that they're going to hell, I would say it's not working because he's got the wrong key. He's not doing it in love. He needs to work out, how does he say the same thing in love? And see if it makes any difference. It's not the telling people about Jesus or sin that's the problem. It's just that he's got the wrong key. So this morning we've been reminded that God is inviting us, that God wants us to participate in the Missio Dei, in God's mission, to be part of this amazing piece of jazz music that's been going on from the beginning of time, where God wants to interact in our lives and in our worlds and in the situations we find ourselves in. God is already doing that, invites us to join in. And so we've got to get in tune with what God is doing. We've got to be listening to what God is already doing, looking at the example of Jesus through Scripture and in our own lives, and listen for that rhythm and the chord progression. And once we're going, yeah, I think we've got it, then we can launch in with our own improvisation, whatever that might be, that lights our faith up. We need to pick up our instruments and go for it. Experience this incredible, fulfilling, exciting experience of participating in God's mission. But now, as we seamlessly move from this into the third part of our service, participation, I encourage you to reflect, well, what is it for you? Those questions I asked earlier, what is your understanding of mission? How is that playing out in your life? What does set your faith on fire? What is the thing that you get passionate about and going, well, how do I pick up that instrument? What would it mean for me to be playing, improvising with that, if I've got the foundation, the fundamentals right? We're going to reflect on that, but I'm going to invite us to do that in a participatory way. And we're going to do that in three ways. Firstly, we're going to pray together. And I'm going to invite Eunice up in a moment to come and to lead us in prayer. But after that, I'm actually going to invite us to participate by coming out the front here. Normally what we'd do at this point is we'd have a song and we'd take up our offering. We're not going to do it like that today. But instead, we're going to, after the prayer, I'm going to pray a prayer over the communion elements, and then we're going to have our song. But I'm going to invite possibly the musos to do it first so they can still participate. I just want you to somehow come down the middle to receive communion. But the first thing I want you to look at as you come down to communion is the cross. Because we respond to what Jesus has done for us. We love because God first loved us. So our response, this is a response to what has already had happened. So I want you to focus on the cross. That cross there, it comes from the young people's breakaway camp that they've just had recently, where they were talking about connecting to Jesus and connecting to the story of the cross. And so I want you to come down, but I don't want you just to look at it. I want you to physically respond to that. And so I have a whole bunch of crosses here. And whether or not you just touch a cross on the way past, or whether you just take a moment to hold a cross in your hand and think about what Jesus has done for us. To think about the fact that God has loved us first. That while we were still sinners, as Romans says, this will happen. We're responding to what has already happened to us. Then as you move along the table, you'll see the offerings here. Now I know many of you give directly, so you're probably not going to put anything in the offering plate. I still want you to touch the offering plate as well. If you have got your offering here, you can actually physically put it in here, because we're not going to pass the bags around today. But as a way of responding, that's what offering is. But this is sort of tying it together. We're responding to what Jesus has already done for us. And not only do we give our finances, we give ourselves. And maybe we give that thing we're passionate about, going, well, if I'm passionate about this, here, I give it to you, God, for your work in your mission. And then to move through and to receive communion as a way of cementing that commitment. There's no service today. There's no stewards. So I invite you to rip a piece of bread out, dip it in the cup yourself. If you are gluten-free, that's the stuff at the back. So this glass cup is only for the gluten-free bread. Don't mix them together. So the front part's the gluten, the back part's the gluten-free. Got that? I don't want you to rush this, but as somebody noted this morning, you may need to move slightly away from the table to do your reflecting, or reflect as you walk back, otherwise we'll take forever to get through. Does that make sense? So come through, think of the cross, physically touch the cross as a way of connecting with that. Touch the offering bags, you can put your offering if you want, and then physically hold a representation of the love of God in your hands as we receive communion. I'm going to hand over to Eunice, who's going to begin this process